social is we're talking about society. Okay, so again, take a look at these. We're going to go through them in detail. Physical, psychological, behavioral, societal. Have any of you had this training before? Or, okay, yes.
I had a training with CPS. Every year I had a training with CPS. That was my previous job. So I'm kind of familiar with that.
Great! I can look to Oh, good, okay. And I don't know the I think they do get into short-term and long-term. I'm sure all of that.
They go into a lot of details.
Yeah. Okay. And that's great that you do. And I think, as I said before, even with these trainings, if it's redundant, I think it's always important to have refreshers of trainings to keep things so we don't forget any of this. So when we talk about physical consequences, I put FC for foster care, so you know what that stands for. And this is just some data I wanted to give you, some statistics. Children in foster care that are in foster care for more than 12 months have some reoccurring health problems. Okay, so there's some physical problems that will follow them along. So this is from the data. People that report being abused, okay, we see a correlation with people who have reported a history of abuse, and I'm just saying abuse in general, okay, I'm not specifying any type, and having poor physical health. So they may have hypertension, they may have asthma, they may have ulcers, okay, but we're seeing that there's a higher correlation among individuals who are reporting child abuse in their histories and what's happening with them currently, physically. And this is a very high number, I put it there purposely. 75%, actually more than 75% of children in foster care under 2 years of age were at medium to high risk of problems with brain development. And I'm sure you've heard of shaken baby syndrome. That's one of the most common forms of abuse, particularly for very young children. And that's exactly what you're doing, is damaging their brain, their neck, their spinal cord.
When you say foster care, is that also including facility?
Oh, talking about resident.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes, it's just.
Oh, okay.
Yes. Okay. That's a good question. Okay. As far as psychological consequences, and again, these are oftentimes what, unfortunately, we may not pick up on, okay, because it's not something that's visible. Whereas you may have a disability from an early child abuse, okay, from having received, physical abuse over and over, so you actually have some type of physical problem with it. However, the psychological consequences can be even more far-reaching. Lifelong consequences of abuse include depression, and some of these you're going to see overlap no matter what abuse it is. Okay, so you'll see some features when we get into more specifics of the types of abuse, some features that are more specific to a type of abuse, but there's some that you'll see them in every kind of abuse, okay, as far as outcomes. So depression, low self-esteem, relational problems. Okay. And if you think about relational problems, again, this is someone that's supposed to protect you, that you would have normally a trusting relationship with. We're going to talk about infant mental health later in the afternoon and how significant that is at this point. So that's something that's really distorted for them very early on. So it would make sense that later on it would be distorted, okay, because they had a distorted exposure of it. Poor mental health, emotional health. 80% of young adults who were abused met criteria for one psychiatric condition. Okay. And again, you can see the significance of that, how high that is. And cognitive differences, definitely when we take measures of intelligence measures, academic measures, there's differences there as well. Okay. And there's a whole host of research having to do with individuals in the foster care system and for different lengths of time and outcomes. Okay, and for the most part, there's a lot of negative outcomes. And again, that's being tied to what they were subjected to early on. Okay, there's been all different types of research in all these different areas. When we talk about criminal behavior, that's also something that we see a lot of incarceration. So a lot of individuals in the jails have been in foster care. Social difficulties, definitely, we already talked about relational problems. In fact, some even develop antisocial traits, okay, which again, it's going to make it difficult for them to have any type of relationship, meaningful relationship with people. And when we get into sexual abuse, definitely in the area of when it comes to intimacy, it's going to be very distorted for a child who's suffered that. So these are just the broad categories of the domains affected. Behavioral consequences. We see higher levels of clinical, so we're talking about clinical disorders, mental health disorders, borderline levels, so they may have some traits of levels of behavior problems, okay, with individuals, again, who have a history of abuse. Okay, 2 times higher than the general population. We know that at different periods, there's more difficulties during adolescence. Okay, we see 25% higher rates for drug use, delinquency, teen pregnancy, poor academic functioning, and definitely impulsivity, sexual risk-taking is part of that. Okay, so that's 25% higher, again, for adolescents who have had a background of abuse. Later on, after they get through adolescence, increased likelihood of smoking, okay, alcohol abuse, illicit drug use, and that's a huge area that's been investigated quite a bit. Okay, and as we even mentioned with risk factors regarding abuse, drug abuse is oftentimes very intertwined with it. Okay, the parents are stressed out, so then there's drugs involved, and then unfortunately that ends up being part of the problem. Criminal antisocial behavior, 11 times more likely as a juvenile to be arrested. Okay, so that's higher when they have a background of abuse. 3 times more likely to be involved in a violent crime as an adult. And we do see that with our statistics of individuals who are incarcerated, who are in the criminal system now. And we had mentioned this before with prevalence. 1/3 of all abused and neglected children will abuse their own children. Okay, and that's a very high statistic. And definitely drug rehab programs, support groups, most of the individuals in those groups, I think it's 2/3 or more, will report being abused as children. So again, there's that link with the drug element. What do I mean by societal consequences? So how does it impact society, all of us? Okay, well, it's broken down into 2 different areas, one of direct costs, one of indirect costs. And direct costs really being what makes up the child welfare system and the different entities that are involved with that system and interact with that system. So the investigation, law enforcement, our judicial system, the court system that they need to go through, health system that they interact with, and definitely mental health, which majority do get linked to. There's been some cases where they don't, and there's been lawsuits as a result of those cases. So those are direct costs, okay, as part of our foster system that are approximate at $24 billion annually. And indirect costs have to do with really those, on all those domains we covered, the 4 domains, how is that impacting economically our society? What's going on with there? We talked about, juvenile delinquency, okay, mental health problems, okay, health issues, unemployment, again, low self-esteem, they're going to have depression, they're going to have some of these things, so more likelihood of unemployment, criminal activity. So all of these also, there's a cost factor related to having individuals who have this long-term baggage, unfortunately, that sometimes will last the rest of their lives, and that's 69 billion annually projected. I know that the numbers are so high, it's you can't get it, it's hard to get your head around it. Okay, so now what I want to do is just kind of go through these different areas. And you may have some more that you can think of that we can add to this and talk about it. So the 4 domains is really, a lot of the research talks about those 4 areas. Okay, and again, we already mentioned that most often children that are maltreated, it's not just one type of abuse that you're focusing in on. Okay, so I do want you to keep in mind there's typically overlap, so sometimes trying to extract one from the other and the effects of one from the other can be kind of convoluted, but there are people who have attempted to do that, and this is kind of what's come out of that research. So some long-term effects of physical abuse. Okay, there's a potential of a long-term physical disability related to the abuse. If it was severe enough, they could have some type of cognitive, developmental impairment, some type of disability as a result of what they suffered. We definitely have children in our CRP that were shaken as children, have brain damage as a result of that, and then they have all kinds of developmental problems as a result of being abused and shaken as a child. Even if you get a hit in the head, there could be eye problems, there could be, bleeding in the brain, you can have neck injuries, like I said, you can have spinal cord injuries, so it could affect your gait and all of that. Other long-term effects, disordered relationships. Again, early on, it's a very troubling relationship that's distorted, right? So psychologists actually sort of expect in many ways that it's going to be difficult to form relationships for these people because that was their earliest model, okay? And hence, this is why we talk about infant mental health and the importance of that early, very tight model of the parent-child dyad. Trouble establishing intimate relations. Okay, so again, the issue of just relationships, meaningful relationships can be difficult because there's the idea of trust comes into play. And if you remember Erik Erikson and his theory, Erikson definitely would project a not so good outcome for these children. Okay, that they would have developed mistrust versus trust. In fact, there's many theorists that you could get into and look at their stages and look at what might be predictive. Definitely higher risk, and we're going to see this, some of these across the board. Higher risk for depression in particular, anxiety, but also substance abuse. Okay, and if you think about it, if that was modeled in the home and that's a coping mechanism, that's something that's learned as well. It also helps relieve or alleviate the mental anguish that they're dealing with. That should be medical illness. Medical illness is also long-term effects of physical abuse, which there's statistics to show that there seems to be a higher percentage of medical issues with this group. And some problems at school or work. Okay, so problems functioning and concentrating, and that also has an element of relational factor to it, so that could